Today I sit down with member scholar Dr. Lemir Teron. Lemir is an associate professor at Howard University in the Department of Earth, Environment, and Equity. And he's now authored a book, Unlearn Power, Strengthening Communities in the Age of Environmental Crisis. And today we're talking about power, who holds it, how it shapes our environment, and who gets left out of the decisions that affect their lives. He explores how environmental inequality is built into our systems and what it would take to center labor, communities, and justice in the way we design our environmental future. The title of your book, Unlearn Power. I want to know where that title originates and what does it mean in the context of the book?
Thank you for the question, Rachel. Unlearn Power forces us to think about power in the literal and also the figurative slash metaphorical sense. So, what I'm proposing, what I'm asking is, how can we unlearn literal or energy power if we think about our energy transitions and decarbonizing? But more metaphorically, how can we unlearn political and economic power? So when we think about how we re-engage with power systems, political and economic systems that have been punishing not just for ecologies, but for societies across the planet, but also specifically marginalized populations.
So you ask the question, what's under the hood? What are people not seeing when it comes to environmental inequality, and the marginalization that you just mentioned? Like, what are people not seeing there?
So what folks aren't seeing is what's under the hood, like some of the things that are in our soils and our water, contaminants, whether we thinking about brownfields or Superfund sites. But when we're really asking what's under the hood, we need to be thinking about who's benefiting from the energy economy status quo. We can think about what's the price that folks are paying. These things aren't always transparent. So when you think about what's under the hood, of our fossilized energy system, we also have to take into account any number of public health and environmental consequences that go along with a carbon intensive energy system, not just related to climate change, but when you think about pollution hotspots and areas that have contaminated water as a result, contaminated soils that have consequences way beyond just ecological impacts, these things come with an assortment of consequences for human communities as well. And to go back to the point about marginalization, we know that environmental hotspots in the US and many places abroad are disproportionately concentrated in marginalized areas. So we're talking about racially marginalized populations. If we think about the US, Black neighborhoods, particularly Black neighborhoods in the South, whether you're talking about the Gulf Coast, further inland, these populations are particularly exposed to harm that comes from embedded pollution.
I live in Cancer Alley, so definitely resonate with what you just stated. Your book also examines environmental injustice as something that happens across time and place, which causes damage to essential ecosystems, to people, and to communities. What are some of the connections between these things? So, like those connections between the ecosystem and people in our communities.
Yeah, so this is a question that forces us to think about dignity and slaughter. So when we think about destabilized ecosystems, it's not hard to imagine that any human populations, any non-human animal populations that are dependent on those ecosystems are going to be subject to slaughter. So there is a direct connection between ecological livelihoods, ecological health, and consequent human health. We may think that economic well-being and race can stave off proximity to slaughter, but eventually, what we do know is ecological destabilization will ultimately get us all. So when we think about things like sea level rise and impacts on coastal communities, absolutely. You mentioned the Gulf Coast where you're positioned. We know that many folks who are in low-lying areas, oftentimes this is associated with race and income, low income, but we know essentially once that water propels itself further inland and inland, Folks who are living in close proximity to petrochemicals, you're talking about the potential mobilization of toxics. That's not something that's going to give any regard for race or income. So certainly, we know that socioeconomics in the short term can fortify you from harm, but it's going to be no long-term panacea.
I could wish we could get everybody to realize that.
Well,
Okay.
ultimately, time will make everyone
Yeah,
realize,
you're right. Yeah, it's
unless,
gonna catch up.
but there's an opportunity to act like adults and make mature decisions. So things don't have to be that way. So we want to leave folks with hope, not fairy tale hope, but if we act like adults and are responsible with our environmental governance, there is a potential, there's a possibility to stave off some of the worst impacts, whether we're talking about related to climate change or all other sorts of environmental harm.
So yeah, we were just talking about democratizing environmental decision making. What does that actually look like in practice?
So it can have many different iterations. With my work, one thing that I really advocate for is strengthening public science because when we put environmental tools in the hands of lay populations, you then give them the opportunity to more comprehensively engage in environmental decision making. But more important than that, it's not enough just to be at the table. We want communities making their own prioritization strategies. So democratization is about local control of environmental decision making, but it can't be a race to the bottom because we know that just because you have local control, it doesn't always mean that a decision is going to be best. Local control may decide for a data center that is locally inappropriate. So we believe in prioritization in the hands of populations, local control, but democratization also has to be undergirded by safeguards that protect communities from making a decision that is, while democratic, can be harmful for a unrepresented segment of the population.
Okay, so where is restorative justice missing in the energy transition? Like, why can't that wait? What steps should we take to bring these principles of restorative justice into the clean energy movement?
Yeah, well, why we can't wait? Because the planet and people are suffering now. So when we think about what will restorative justice look like in a decarbonized energy transition, number one question, or at least at the head of that list, is what does workforce development look like, particularly for economically strapped communities? How can we think about job creation that specifically targets communities that have long been locked out of the economic engine? And then we also need to think about transition for workers who've been associated for decades or longer with the carbonized energy system. So it's one thing to go into a community and say we need to defossilize, but if my livelihood depends on that, I may not be so happy to hear that conversation. So we need to make sure that this energy transition is thinking about the transition for jobs in those sectors,
Mhm.
specifically union jobs. Um, because we know ultimately that's going to protect workers and come with a host of human health benefits, insurance benefits, wage benefits. So those would be two places. And then when we think about restorative justice, we need to think about where do these technologies end up landing? What are our strategies to infuse community solar, geothermal, weatherization in households that aren't necessarily equipped to buy these technologies? For renters who don't necessarily have an economic stake, a long-term economic stake in a property, there needs to be a coherent strategy to make sure that those folks can be viable players in the renewable energy transitions, notwithstanding what your income is, notwithstanding what your mortgage versus renter status is.
I love those examples. Are there any other examples of concrete things governments could do to be more just or equitable?
Yeah, absolutely. Education and purchasing. So when we think about what do our purchasing agendas look like on the local government level, these entities all have, not all, but many have public transit fleets. Are these clean energy transit fleets? What do
Mhm.
our local microgrid entities look like? And where are we buying the equipment to infuse these microgrids and renewable energy transition centers. And then finally, educational component has to be the piece. So when we think about the hundreds or maybe even thousands of colleges that have programs related to energy and engineering, what does it look like on a community college level? What does it look like on a university level or even on the high school level? Are we training workers to engage, smartly engage in these technologies, not just so they'll be consumers, but so that we can be designers and deployers of these technologies? Those are things that local governments and state governments, and dare I say, even the federal government can directly support.
You talk a lot about labor in the workforce. Why is that such a critical part of environmental solutions? And why is it often left out of the conversation?
So the fundamental driving question of my book is where's labor? If we can
Mhm.
imagine an energy transition, if we can imagine urban and community forestry systems, if we can imagine just urbanization, issues of endemic to 21st century living, if we can't imagine labor being at the forefront in a dignified fashion of these questions and conversations, I don't think that the end game is going to be hospitable for a dignified 21st century workforce. So, labor is at the forefront of my research and at the forefront of the activity that I do, because what we know is frontline communities, frontline workers are at the precipice or they're the most exposed to environmental fallout. So when we think about places like the Gulf Coast, when you have extreme temperature days, folks who are doing outdoor work, or in many cases, even indoor work, try working in a dry cleaner on a 95 plus degree day. We know that these folks are going to be exposed to some pretty inhospitable conditions. So, unless we're centering their health and safety as part of our energy transition, as part of our climate transition, then it almost becomes just this is a rarefied air conversation for the elites. That's the antithesis of what we're trying to do. And then let's take it to our food system. We talked a little bit about energy. Um, Very quick portion of a book. I call it the intermezzo, deals with farm workers. It's not a book about food, but food is something that connects us all. So I go to farm country and I interview a person for the book who's been working for the last decade or so with and on behalf of farm workers. And what we discovered, or what I discovered in my research or within my studies, is man, farm workers, not only are they exposed to some pretty toxic chemicals to support this status quo food system, but so many areas of dignified life get stripped from these folks. Decision making based where do I live and housing decisions, everyday shopping decisions, right on down to the situation right now when you're looking at folks who disproportionately uh, don't have authorized working status. We see what law enforcement is doing to destabilize many of these households, forcing folks to live beyond the cover. So it's a situation that, unless we're in tune with the livelihood of workers, then I just don't see an environmental agenda, specifically an environmental justice agenda, that's going to give us anything hopeful on the back end.
What do you hope that people do differently once they've read this book?
So the end game has to be we are in a moment of crisis, as the book's subtitle suggests or asserts. We have to change the terms of engagement. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're in this moment of the new Jim Crow. We're in a time of brazen political corruption, and we're going to have to be well adjusted to what conflict looks like within that political and economic sphere. So what does it mean when you have a court system that is destabilizing and that is destabilizing things like the Voters' Rights Act? If we're not well adjusted to direct conflict with folks who are trying to not only usurp the basic rights to vote and basic civil rights, then I'd say conventional means aren't going to get us to the promised land that we're looking to. So we're going to need environmental law to repivot itself. What does it look like for environmental law efforts to say, you know what, we have a court system that is flagrantly in violation of any sensible, any ethical judicial statutes? How do we reinterpret our engagement with the court system? Same thing. How do we reinterpret our engagement with political systems that goes beyond, hey, I'm voting for the lesser of two evil candidates tomorrow. What does that reorientation look like? So that's no firm answer, but it's an invitation to say, hey, we have to, in this moment of crisis, uh, really rearrange the terms of engagement with these entities.
So that brings me to my final question, which is for someone watching this who cares about these issues, what does it look like to actually unlearn power in their own community?
Unlearn power means to be engaged, supporting institutions that support you, reimagining what our food systems look like, reimagining what our energy systems look like, but not just reimagining from your coffee table or intellectually or sending a text. Unlearn power means doing the work, being well adjusted to conflict, to restabilize or to reorient societies. And then finally, these have to be global conversations. It starts with the local, but I always tell my students there's more than one cookie company in town. So if the work we're doing is not in conversation and solidarity with many communities across societies, plural, then I'm not sure we're going to have anything coherent on the back end that gives us any semblance of justice, whether it be in our neighborhoods or ones that are 6,000 miles or kilometers away. So we have to be global in our thinking, local in our action.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lemire. Yeah, I'm glad you took the time out of I'm sure you have a busy schedule. So, this is great.
Happy to do this again, and I've enjoyed working with you all this time. So let's have another conversation whenever you see fit, and anything I can do to support your cause, just let me know. Happy to do